So welcome to the Fluids and MHD seminar. Today we've got Björn Hof from the Institute of Science and Technology in Austria. So Björn did his PhD at the University of Manchester. He's had postdoctoral positions in Delft in the Netherlands. Then he was a lecturer in Manchester, had some time as a research group leader in Germany, and has been a professor at IST in Austria since 2013. And he'll be talking today about how pipe flow goes turbulent, a matter of life and death.
Okay, thanks very much, Adrian, for the kind introduction, and thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to give this seminar. And yeah, as we said, please interrupt at any point, especially for the students. If there's something you don't understand, don't be shy, just ask. And yeah, so I gave this talk a little bit of a dramatic title, but the analogies to life and death may be clear later on. It's of course the life and death of turbulence. So yeah, then let's go ahead. The type of flows I'm going to talk about are simple shear flows, and in particular I'm going to talk about Couette flow with a little bit of curvature. So Taylor Couette flow, but with yeah, curvature being quite small, so small gap limit in experiments. And the second one would be channel flow that we'll hopefully have some time to mention. And I'll start, however, with pipe flow. And let me just show these movies here. So in pipes, what you typically would observe at transitional Reynolds numbers is that depending on initial conditions, these flashes or puffs of turbulence appear intermittently, and they advect downstream. They have more or less a constant size. Of course, they fluctuate in size, but they don't overall grow as they travel downstream. Similarly, in Couette flow, you get stripes of turbulence, also localized. So the surrounding fluid is happily laminar. It's now at the back of the cylinder. Now it comes back, the turbulent stripe. And in channel flow, you also have, oops, down, you have stripes of turbulence where you can, depending on initial conditions, you can get different stripe patterns. But yeah, this is one example from one of our experiments. Yeah, okay, so key point is you have coexistence in this transitional regime. In some areas, laminar flow is perfectly happy. Other areas, if you add a perturbation, it will be turbulence. If you don't have any perturbation to the system, at these Reynolds numbers, all these flow would be perfectly laminar. Okay, so yeah, that's basically what I wanted to say. Turbulence sets in if you have perturbations, despite the linear stability of laminar flow, and you have this coexistence, to repeat it in other words. And this, at least for pipe flow, has been known for a very long time. It goes back to the pioneering study of Osborne Reynolds in Manchester, of course, in the late 19th century. And these are just some pictures from his paper, where he, at low velocities, observed that as he injected a streak of dye into the nozzle of this pipe, this streak of dye would just go through the pipe, and apart from some molecular diffusion, would not mix otherwise with the surrounding non-stained fluid. And from that, can clearly conclude the flow is laminar. However, as he increased the velocity, he would first then observe localized patches of turbulence, which now we call puffs, which you saw in the movie. I think I saw the movie a couple more times. And even higher velocities, some distance from the inlet, the entire flow downstream would be turbulent. So that was his observation. Yeah, the movies I already showed. I can put sound off. No. Okay, no, the sound is off. Anyway, you saw this movies before. So and okay, I hope it stops now. No. Hopefully that's it. All right, sorry about that. So then his main point of the paper obviously was that he introduced the Reynolds number. So he basically said that the parameter that matters is, in this case, depending on what you choose, but let's say the bulk velocity times the length scale, we pick the pipe diameter typically divided by the kinematic viscosity of the fluid. And if you do that, then you will find that the transition occurs typically at Reynolds number in pipes of around 2000. Yeah, so that was the key finding. However, already in the same paper, he noticed that if he improved the experimental setup, so he reduced, let's say, the perturbations of the flow, finite amplitude perturbations, then this transition point moved, and I think it moved as much as to Reynolds number 13,000 in this better setup, and this, of course, is a little bit problematic in if at the same time you want to convey the point that the Reynolds number is the only parameter of the problem, then you may want to ask the question, so why does the transition point shift from 2000 to 3000 if you change the setup? And there have been many experiments on that problem since. I'm listing just a few of the key works down here in the course of the 20th century. And let me at this point also state that I'm mainly going to focus on experimental results in this talk. I'll briefly mention some of the theoretical work, but I believe some of you may have also seen talks by some of the theorists in the field, like Dwight Barclay or Nigel Goldenfeld. So this talk will be focused on experiments. So saying that, let me just go back to Reynolds' paper and read out a paragraph which I think is rather well important for this talk, certainly, but I think it shows how much insight into the problem actually Reynolds already had in the very first study of the problem. So he said here, it became clear to me that if in a tube of sufficient length, the water were at first, so that I should say that is an answer to this observation that he sometimes found transition at 2000 in this original setup, an improved setup only at 13,000. So again, it became clear to me that if in a tube of sufficient length, the water were at first admitted in a high state of disturbance, then as the water proceeded along the tube, the disturbance would settle down into a steady condition. So basically what he says here, that if you perturb your flow, let's say somewhere at the inlet, and you need a very long pipe, so he said tube of sufficient length, then you look downstream what happens to the flow. So and what happens then? So it would settle down into a steady condition, which condition would be one of eddies, that's what we call turbulence, or steady motion, so laminar flow, according to whether the velocity was above or below what may be called the real critical value. So what he postulated is that if, despite this problem of Reynolds number 2000 or 13,000, that there should be a real critical value, and you should follow this procedure that he describes here. Now, this sounds terribly simple, and I'm trying to convince you that it is everything but simple to try to do that. Okay, now a few words about theory. So already early on, I mean, there's a number of sort of very prominent people who studied linear stability of these types of flows. So pipe flow, channel flow, and Couette flow. I just collected these for these three geometries. So they were Kelvin, Brady. For Couette, I guess Lorentz did pipe flow. Sommerfeld and Heisenberg did channel flow, for instance. Yeah, others, Pantelor and so on. So, and all these people tried techniques, type of linear stability analysis. And as we now know, at least for Couette flow, we know it explicitly. For pipe flow, it's also known up to Reynolds number 10 to the 7, that the laminar flow is stable to infinitesimal perturbations. So linear stability is not going to answer the question about why this transition happens. And you can already see that, I showed you in the videos before, you have coexistence between laminar and turbulent flow in all these geometries at these low Reynolds numbers. So if the laminar flow, so it must be linearly stable, otherwise it wouldn't be possible. Okay, so that much for theory. now back to experiments. So why can't we do this simple experiment, or not so easily, that Reynolds described? If you look in a pipe flow and you now perturb the flow by different means, let's say in one case you add a perturbation that is pretty strong in terms of distorting your velocity profile. So what is plotted here is a centerline velocity, and it's normalized with a bulk velocity. So the centerline velocity in Hagen-Poiseuille flow would be twice the bulk. So if we are up here, this would be the laminar flow at 2. And so we blunted the profile very substantially at this point by injection of multiple jets in one case. In another case, we blocked the pipe partially. No, we put an orifice in, but it's also kind of a blockage. Here we just blocked half the pipe in the third case. You see in all these cases, the centerline velocity just downstream of the perturbation drops dramatically. In the fourth case, we have a very subtle perturbation where we just inject a droplet of fluid every now and then. You see these little dips. So that's where we added one perturbation each time. And the outcome, however, and this is at Reynolds number, I think a little bit above 2050 or 2100. It may appear later. It doesn't matter too much, but it's in the first case, surprisingly, which is about the strongest perturbation. If you look at the mean flow disturbance downstream, nothing happens. You don't get any spikes anymore. Now I have to apologize. This is not a centerline velocity measure. This is actually a pressure signal at downstream. We only had one of these LDV velocity sensors downstream. We had to measure pressure drop. So if there's a spike, you basically have a turbulent puff. If it's flat, you have laminar flow. So here, all the flow that arrives downstream, we measure at 2 positions, 2 locations downstream, is laminar. In the second case, identical Reynolds number, just different initial conditions. Some puffs, some of these turbulent puffs have developed. You see these spikes, but the flow is far from fully turbulent, even though we had a fully turbulent initial condition. Third case, you have rather many irregular of these spikes, so many puffs, but coming at different times. And in the fourth one, for each perturbation we put in, we get exactly one of those spikes. And you can look 250 diameters downstream, you can go 10 times downstream. It hardly changes. The spikes are almost have the same sequence and timing when they pass by. So, just adding a perturbation can have very counterintuitive effects. And in this case, you wouldn't know, if you had the first one, you would think, okay, I'm probably simply below the critical velocity, so there's no turbulence here. But if you look at then the other different perturbations, you get a different answer. All right. So how we then approach this problem, and here I'm going to show videos from numerical simulations, even though we did it pretty much experimentally, is that we looked at the growth and decay processes. Showing the videos from simulations, which we did alongside the experiments, has a big advantage that we can stay in a co-moving frame of reference. So the simulations have periodic boundary conditions, and even though this path moves downstream, we can pick a frame of reference where it stays where we want it to be. And you see that this turbulent path, I'm showing streamwise vorticity, changes chaotically for a certain time. And at some point, however, it will decay, which is something we didn't see before from the experiments I showed to you. But it turns out that turbulent paths are transient. And the video I showed to you was at Reynolds 1850, where they're rather short-lived. So this green data set, this is turbulent kinetic energy, this is time. This is roughly the turbulent level. It bounces around here for some time, but then quickly it decays. If you go to a little bit higher Reynolds numbers, it survives longer. If you go to not even that high, 1950, it survives an awful lot longer and then decays. So the point I want to make here is, please note that the decay, irrespective of how long the puff lived, the decay is always rather sharp. So once the puff decides to decay, it's gone within 50 of these advective time units that are plotted down here. Another way of phrasing this, these turbulent paths do not age. So what we would see in an aging process is that the turbulent kinetic energy drops gradually until the structure eventually is dead, right? But this doesn't happen. So it lives unaffected basically by anything until it suddenly and sharply decays. And this is reminiscent to memoryless processes, which you know, most familiar one is probably radioactive decay, where an atom lives fully intact for millions or billions of years, depending on what you look at, and then it decays at some point. Okay, so this is actually the exact ansatz that we took. We tried to model this, or others before us also, as a memoryless process or Poisson process, where if you plot the survival, as an element, the survival probability of these paths, so you pick, let's say, 200, 300 paths. This is done numerically by Avila and Willis. If you pick them, you know, 300 different initial conditions, let's say, at a given Reynolds number, then what happens as time proceeds is that the number of paths go down, of course, but if you plot the survival probability as a function of time, they fall on these exponential tails, which is exactly what you expect for a Poisson process. And then you can take this ansatz that the survival probability is exponential to the power of minus t divided by some characteristic time scale. And this characteristic time scale will depend on the Reynolds number, and this is basically what we're after. In particular, initially people were interested in a point, a particular Reynolds number where this characteristic time scale may diverge. So if at some point, at some Reynolds number, this becomes infinite, this would be our critical point where, you know, correspondingly critical velocity that Reynolds was talking about, where turbulence becomes sustained. So that was one of the initial questions more than a decade ago, where people were hoping to determine the nature of the transition. And I'm just showing you, since we did all this in experiments, I'm showing you some experiments where we perturb the flow. Well, I should stop, maybe expand a little bit. So what we see is a pipe here, this small pipe, and the water comes out at a certain angle. Now I just added a perturbation upstream, which you didn't see, but about 5 meters upstream, whenever a red spot appears here, perturbation is added. And what you should see a few seconds later, when this perturbation is advected downstream, if it survives, the profile is blunted when the flow is turbulent, and the water will come out at a different angle. So this will dip down whenever turbulence survives. So let's continue, and there should be a dip any second. So you just saw that. That was one turbulent path. Now I perturb again, and as far as I remember, the second one does not survive. So there's no dip. Creating a third one, so another perturbation, and this one dipped. So it's a stochastic process. That's all I'm trying to say, and you can model it as a memoryless process. And that's exactly what we did. So these curves are the experimental results. And here we measured at a given distance from the inlet. So we don't have quite as much information as we had in the simulations here. So I didn't say which paper. Okay, so this is by Avila, Willis, and myself, 2010 JFM, I seem to remember. Okay, but what we can nevertheless do, we know the distance. So we measure just at one point, which is the exit of the pipe, but we can change the perturbation point upstream, and we know the distance between the perturbation point and our measurement point here, and we know the speed of the turbulent paths. So basically, with that information, basically we know then T, this one here, we can, and we measure the probability that a path survives for this distance at this particular Reynolds number, if we pick one point, and then we can compute tau from that. We can do this for all these measurements. So each of these measurements were about 50 to 100 paths. At the higher Reynolds, at the low Reynolds numbers, probably around 100, I think here. At the high Reynolds numbers for the last point, so the higher the Reynolds number, the more we had to increase the number of paths, and we had to go up to 10 to the 5 paths that we initiated for this one data point here. Nevertheless, you know, even at this Reynolds number 2000 and 40 or so, 8 of these still decayed, so turbulence remained transient. Remember, we were looking for something that becomes sustained at a critical point, and none of these curves, what you would expect is that they go up and somewhere hit the probability 1, but at none of these points we really hit the probability of 1. They were all slightly below 1, so a certain fraction decay, even though a very small fraction in this case. Now, with this ansatz, we can collapse all this data to a single curve. What I'm plotting now is this characteristic time scale I mentioned. Think of it as a half-lifetime for radioactive decay. It's exactly equivalent to that as a function of Reynolds number, and you see that lifetimes increase extremely fast. So that's a logarithmic scale here. So they're actually faster than exponential. Nevertheless, as I said, turbulence remains transient even at the highest Reynolds numbers we could reach. And if you plot now the inverse of tau, which would be the decay rate, what this means is that the decay rate always remains finite. There's no critical point where the decay rate of an individual puff, so this is all for individual puffs, would become 0. So you cannot define a critical point based on just the decay of puffs. The decay doesn't stop. Puffs remain transient. So that was somewhat surprising at the time. Other people, well, okay, that was ourselves. We confirmed this in direct numerical simulations. So that's Avila Willis, JFM, and other people did experiments. And I think this is quite well established by now. So that is about the decay of puffs. Now, to solve this problem and to explain when turbulence becomes first sustained, we need to look not only at the decay, but we also have to look at the spreading process, which at least in this context was first, I think, brought up, at least its relevance to the critical point by this nice paper by Moxley and Barclay. And the process that matters is puff splitting. And I'm just showing this from a DNS by Mark Avila and my group again, where you start with a puff that was a little bit larger, so that's slightly higher Reynolds number, and eventually some vorticity escaped far enough downstream to form a second puff. And I could tell you why puffs, remain localized at these Reynolds numbers, but I won't have time to go into it. If you do want to know, ask a question about it later. I'm happy to explain. All right, so then as we vary the Reynolds number, what you will see is basically at low Reynolds numbers, puffs may start, attempt to split, but it typically doesn't work. At least the probability is very low for a successful splitting. Whereas if you go to higher Reynolds number, sort of these space-time plots, time goes upwards in this space, you start with a single puff that then branches out, and eventually you have 5-6 puffs after a few thousand effective time units. Okay, so this is the main spreading process. And this, I won't show it, but this happens to be equally a memoryless process, meaning that the probability for such a splitting to happen is constant in time. You don't have any accumulation over time. It doesn't become more probable at the next time step. It's always equally probable, regardless of how much time has elapsed. So that's basically this memoryless notion again. And you can equally then measure experimentally as well as numerically, and we did both, the characteristic timescales for these processes. And this is what is plotted here. So now the left curve, the colorful one, is what I talked about last. So these are the characteristic timescale for such a splitting event to happen. So for turbulence to seed a new puff, let's say. And you see that with increasing Reynolds number, the time that elapses for such a splitting on average to happen goes down quite dramatically. The left curve are the lifetimes I spoke about before. So these are the characteristic lifetimes, the times you have to wait on average for a puff to decay at a given Reynolds number. So the key point about all this is that these two processes are balanced at a certain point, this intersection point, which is around about 2036 in Reynolds number. And at this point, you have equal probability for a puff to either split or decay. And it will take a long time for anything to happen. So if you look at the scales here, it's about a few times 10 to the 7 effective time units. Your puff in these units has a velocity of 1 if you non-dimensionalize it, meaning that for such an event to happen, the puff will travel downstream the pipe by more than 10 to the 7 pipe diameters. And this is the key difficulty. So let me point this out first. So if you're to the left of this intersection point, your probability for things to decay will outweigh eventually. So even if you start with many puffs, eventually, if you wait for long enough times, all of them will decay. Of course, you need an extremely long pipe for this. Or you would, I mean, in practice, it's almost impossible. But if you're to the right of this point, the probability for puffs to split and for turbulence fraction to increase is larger than the decay. And for this to be meaningful, you have to take the thermodynamic limit. So you have to make your pipe infinitely long, and you have to start with infinitely many puffs. But if you're to the right of this intersection point in the thermodynamic limit, you will keep a finite fraction of turbulence in your pipe. Whereas if you're to the left, everything decays. And exactly in that sense, this defines a critical point. And it defines the critical point that Reynolds described. So, he said, if in a pipe of sufficient length and so on, you have to perturb initially. And the question was, where's the threshold above which some turbulence survives, whereas below which everything decays? So maybe this is a good time to ask if somebody has questions. Anybody? Everything clear so far?
For the spreading, Björn, do you do that using DNS, or is that experimental as well?
So this is mainly experimental. We always tend to do both. So in the left curve, these open triangles, so they were simulated basically by us. All the rest is experiments. And on the right curve, all the colored points are from experiments. And the triangles, okay, I don't remember now. I think DNS1 is probably the one done in our group. DNS2 was the one done by Dave Moxie and Dwight's group. So we had two different codes, and we simulated this. Of course, at the time we didn't get very far because it becomes rather costly. You have to wait for long times. You have to do many repetitions. You need many puffs to have some meaningful statistics. Yeah. So in experiments, you need a lot of control of your flow and on the Reynolds number, but then it becomes sort of feasible to do this even close to the critical point. And as I said, you need 100,000 cases or so for statistics here, or even more. But yeah, overall, I think these two curves have close to or more than 1 million puff statistical cases that we looked at from the experiments. In DNS, of course, it's less, but yeah.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Sure. All right. So anyway, so with this, we can sort of answer the question about the critical Reynolds number, and then the question that remains of what nature is this transition. So I showed the spreading curves before in space-time, so I don't think I have to explain this again. Yeah. So we basically claimed that this is a non-equilibrium phase transition and could be described in more detail in this framework of statistical mechanics. And this is what I want to talk about for the rest of the talk. Okay, this is sort of a curious observation. So done by Kaneko and Crutchfield, or rather, I don't know, maybe controversial at the time, I'm not sure, but they published this paper where they questioned if attractors are relevant for turbulence, and they proposed that transients could be the key, super transients, so very long-lived transients, that turned out to be exactly right. I mean, that's exactly what we find. These puffs are all transient, and they would fall into one of these classifications of super transients with memoryless lifetime statistics and so on. So there have been some nice previous works, and there's also a review article by Ted and Dai about super transients, which is interesting. So one key point underlying this is, which I didn't say explicitly, that what drives turbulence and what makes it sustained are sort of spatial interactions. If you just look at individual turbulent path sites, then this won't tell you the answer. You have to look at spatial interactions. You have to look at many of them. This we couldn't do in this experiment. Simply, we could only do the statistics, but to get the critical point, this is enough. If you look at sort of the growth spatial expansion process, if you want to learn something about the type of phase transition, you need interactions. And this is very hard in pipe flow because of these huge time scales involved and these enormous pipe lengths, 10 to the 7, 10 to the 8 diameters, even longer, that you would need to do such an experiment. There have been a lot of studies on such spatial temporal phenomena in simple systems like coupled map lattices. This was also introduced by Kaneko in late 80s, I think, and worked on by others like Chaté-Manville and so on, where you get phase transitions, even though each of these sites of these coupled maps, each map itself only has transient chaos. But as you increase the coupling strength, by interactions, the system overall may become sustained if the interactions are large enough, and then you keep a finite fraction of these maps always in the active chaotic state. Okay, so there are various ideas along those lines, and also Paul Manville had a number of papers in this direction. So one of the earliest ideas along those lines actually goes back to Yves Pommeau, and that was an analogy to directed percolation. And this is what I want to describe now in a couple of slides. Directed percolation is a universality class, and I'll give you one visual example here, which is that of a fluid in a porous medium and discretized in space and time. Time goes down, and space is here in the horizontal. And on these lattice sites, you can either, they can either be dry or they can be wet. So you can, as I said, you can think of it as water going down a porous material. And if these links here are open, the water can proceed. Or if I draw a link, open, closed, whatever. If I draw a link, then the water can proceed one level down. So in the next time step, I now have water here. In the next time step afterwards, I happen to get two wet sides. And for each of these links, I sort of roll a dice and I have a certain probability, a certain chance that the water may or may not proceed. And depending on this probability, if this probability is smaller than 0.64, I will basically always get stuck. Even if I have an infinitely large system, all the sides wet initially, as I go down in time, the water will never proceed for indefinitely. However, if I'm above 0.65 probability that these links are closed, if I take the thermodynamic limit again, I will always have a connected path that takes the water indefinitely far down in time. So yeah, so this is just sort of, the critical point is somewhere between 0.64 and 0.65. If I'm below the critical point, I will get stuck. Here I have a connected path. This is a little bit above the critical point. And if I'm far above the critical point, I will, even from a single seed, I will get lots of wet sites downstream. You can equally think of that as a pandemic spreading in a population. This is also a very naive, simple model for that, or for forest fires, let's say. And there are many systems falling into this universality class. So the first person who saw this analogy to transition to turbulence, as I said, was Yves Pommeau. And the key point about this analogy is that, if you think of the wet sides now as turbulent flow and the open sides here as laminar flow, should go back a couple of steps. The laminar flow, because of its linear stability, acts as what is called an absorbing state. So if at some point, just by chance, I don't proceed to the next level, or, oops, I shouldn't do that. I don't want to proceed to the next level. Then all my sides here are dry at this point in time. And if I have only dry seats, water won't arise by itself. Likewise, if all the flow is laminar, I cannot get any turbulence into the system because the flow is linearly stable. And that's exactly what is meant by an absorbing state. Okay, so that puts us into this framework of absorbing state phase transitions. Another key aspect to it is what I said before, this memoryless nature of the processes, which was not known before to Pomo or anybody. But anyway, let me just point out, if you want to figure out if your system is in this universality class, there are three critical exponents you have to determine. There are more than three critical exponents in that you can compute, but you need three that don't depend on each other. And I give three examples here. So the obvious one to look at is the amount of or the density of active sites. So I let this run for a rather long time, and then I just check, what number of my density of my sites is in the active state. And this continuously goes up, so it's 0 below the critical point, and then it continuously goes up with a power law, and this power law is 0.276 for a one-dimensional directed population. You have a correlation in space, again, a power law, and a correlation length in the time domain, which is another power law. And all these three, if you can compute them, you know that you're in the directed population universality class. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on time, but let's try to go over this quickly because I do want to show the results for sure. So view this analogy in a different way. So I showed you the lifetimes before. So I just showed this on double logarithmic here, and I'm sorry about the poor quality of the slides. This is again characteristic time scale for the decay, double logarithmic, then it gives straight lines here. That's the measurements in the experiment. And this is for the splitting probability here. And think of it that way, we take a similar lattice, we make it square, not diagonal, but never mind. So down, in time, we interpret this as survival of our path. This is one side is one turbulent path. That's the probability to survive. So I can pick a Reynolds number and a certain time scale is given then for both these curves at 2060 here. Which I plotted here, and then I just say one step in time I discretize to 10 to the 6 effective time unit, and then I can play exactly the same game. I have a certain probability to decay given by that, and a probability to split, and the splitting happens much more often in this case. So after every fifth step, I should see a splitting on average. So I have one here, and decays basically don't matter. I would have to step very far to see the first decay. And so on. If I play this game, I will find with these numbers from the experiment, I will find exactly that I'm in the directed percolation universality. So you can think of the analogy like that. Okay, so in pipe flow, this is almost impossible to do in experiments because of these huge time scales. As I said, we would need pipes in excess of 10 to the 8 diameters to do that reasonably. Luckily, we have other flows at our disposal, and the best one to choose for obvious reasons is Couette flow, because here I can pick a frame of reference. In planar Couette I could do that, where my advection velocity is 0, but even better is if I work in a curved system, Taylor Couette flow, where I have periodic boundary conditions, and I don't even have to worry about advection of my turbulent sides. They will come back, they stay in my system. What I, however, still have to do is I need huge aspect ratios to do these measurements. So typically I will go to a very small gap, and I want to make this azimuthal direction in the first set of experiments I show extremely large. In the second one, I will also want to make this actual aspect ratio very large. We drive the system by outer cylinder rotation, so that we do not have any linear instability, right? So the flow is linearly stable. It behaves like a Couette flow. I don't get any Taylor vortices, but I get stripes of turbulence. we can show that the decay and the splitting both follow these sort of faster than exponential laws. I mean, qualitatively similar to pipes. Of course, the numbers are different. Critical point is around 320 something. Never mind. The critical point is not universal. What should be universal are these three critical exponents that I showed you. Here, the numbers for the experiment, we made this azimuthal aspect ratio of around 5,000, where the gap width is 2H. And in real terms, the gap width was 250 microns in size. Okay, so now I show you what you see in the experiment. So when you look once around, so we unfold this cylinder and lay it out here, you see in dark gray or black, you see the stripes of turbulence bouncing around. In light gray, you see the laminar fluid in between. And the key point is now you can observe this for any times you want, basically. Well, not quite true until your seeding particles settle out. So there many practical issues. Took us years to set these experiments up, but eventually we got it to work. Now you can turn this video by 90 degrees. You false color it, turbulent sides blue, laminar yellow, but it's exactly the same data that you're looking at. It's the same video, basically. And now you see this sort of percolation type behavior. You see these active turbulent sides, and sometimes you have more, sometimes they split, sometimes they decay. Here's a point where almost everything would have died, but it didn't. One survived, it branched out again, and you get all these interactions that you need in order to determine the critical exponents that tell you if or if not you are in the universality class of direct percolation or some other universality class. All right, so that's what we did. So that's for Couette flow. This is a simple directed percolation simulation. All this was done by Grégoire Lemout, my postdoc at the time. Now it's CNRS in Le Havre. And below the critical point, round about the critical point, above the critical point, now we compare to directed percolation. The first exponent was for the turbulent fraction or density of active sites, whatever you want to call it. What directed percolation would want you to see is an exponent of 0.276. And I always put the universal values in red in these figures. And you see there's a nice scaling range where we happen to be exactly on this exponent. We also did this in DNS studies. A PhD student of mine, Liang Shi, did these simulations, and of course we cannot do as much statistics. We had a smaller system, but you know there's a nice scaling range, or by a bit smaller, but we get exactly the exponent that's predicted by directed percolation. Second exponent would be the spatial correlation exponents, so the sort of the characteristic length in this space direction. And again, in red, the directed percolation prediction, and we have about 2 decades of scaling range where we happen to exactly fall on the predicted value, and DNS works equally nicely. Third one now is a correlation in the time domain. And so, I couldn't hear that. Can you repeat, please?
I think someone left the microphone on by mistake, so I think you can ignore it. I just muted them.
I see. Okay, I thought it was a question. All right, good. So third exponent then is the temporal one. And again, you know, there's basically, we only look for a slope here. So that one is a pretty good measure, I would say. There's no critical point or anything which we need to fit, whereas for the density there is. But these ones, you know, give you exactly the correct slope for about 2 decades where we could measure, and the DNS also fits in very well. So let me just check how am I doing on time. Okay, I may go a little bit over time, but I try to go to this rather quickly. So the key point here in this first experiment, the key difficulty was to get the accuracy of the experiment right. I sort of indicated, so this whole measurement was done in a 250 micron gap, and the height was only 16 times that gap width, or 8 times, yes, 8 times that gap width. And we have to do this to get many stripes. Like you couldn't do a directed percolation simulation if you only have like a handful of active sites. So this would be a rather poor simulation. Likewise, in these fluid flows, the typical spacing between puffs or stripes is of order 50, let's say, gap width. And this dictates kind of a minimum size, system size that you need to realize that. The timescales are even much worse, but here this is what I said, this is why we pick Couette flow with periodic boundary conditions. Here we can afford to look for very long times, which would be basically impossible in pipes or channel flows. All right, so now we spent almost a decade on developing a system that's accurate enough that we can also keep this accuracy over a large length of the cylinder, as well as azimuthally, of course. And this resulted in something that in no way resembles this cartoon here. Rather, you should think of it, this gap is extremely small. Again, it's around 250, I think it's 240 microns. That's in this case, 240 microns. Aspect ratios are order of thousands. You can, if you think of it as a sheet of A4 paper, it's pretty much, I mean, let's say 2 thicknesses of standard paper would be close to 250 microns, and the length and width are pretty much that of, unfolded azimuthally. This would be the size we're talking about. And now you have to expose this to velocities of the outer cylinder of about 10 meters per second, and the inner cylinder stationary. So you need huge shear. You have to transport all this temperature that you create, the heat that you create away, to keep the temperature as constant as possible to about 0.02 Kelvin or so is what we typically manage. So there are lots of difficulties which my students and postdocs, I think there was 6 or 7 of them working over the years on this experiment, had to deal with. And eventually, the person who has got the results here, Lucas Couette, we got these results only about half a year ago. But yeah, let me just show what we got. Okay, so this I've skipped. So earlier results for Couette flow suggested that this transition is discontinuous. It's not of second order. It cannot be directed percolation. But they had much smaller system sizes in computations and in experiments. So we have huge aspect ratios in comparison to that. And then what you observe in the 2D case, again, this is false color, you see these stripes and they bounce around in time. We reconstruct this from line cameras, so that the time resolution, it's a little bit not 100% smooth, but anyway, it's sufficient enough to get all the information we need. All right, and you can reconstruct sort of the spatial picture of the entire flow. Right, to cut the long story short, this is what we get now for the directed percolation comparison. For a 2D directed percolation system, the exponents are different ones. So this is a very nice test, and I'm showing here the literature values. So instead of 0.276 for the turbulent fraction, you have 0.58. And this is exactly what we find over at least more than a decade in the scaling range. 2 different experimental runs even shown here. And over that quickly. So the other exponents again are different from the 1D ones, but you find this very nice scaling range, a little bit over a decade here in the spatial, and this is in the temporal correlation length here. Okay, so this all agrees nicely with directed percolation, and yeah, as I mentioned earlier, I'm not talking about theoretical models, but let me just mention there was quite a lot of work on this, and also these nice theoretical models by Dwight Barclay and by Nigel Goldenfeld's group, which I didn't have time to talk about. There's a lot of numerical and experimental studies who all claim directed percolation exponents in different kinds of flows. However, often these experiments, at least, and also the simulations, are not able to resolve these huge time and spatial scales. I think that is key. One should look into each of these cases rather carefully, if or if not, it may be directed percolation. If I have another 5 minutes, I don't know, Adrian, do we have 5 minutes? Or
yeah, sure.
Okay, Then I give you the example of channel flow. Again, I think we started working on this in 2011, and I'm just writing up the paper now. So these are all rather long going experiments, and here it's much harder. Channel flow and pipe flow, as I said, things that vect downstream, we cannot afford to have these huge system sizes. But in channel flow, there's still a surprising result that I can show to you. And this was sort of a claim that it's all directed percolation by Sano's group, which came out in this Nature Physics issue, where we also were present with our first Couette. So they claimed, even though scaling ranges are not as clear as what you saw for Couette flow, but they claimed agreement with directed percolation. However, they found a critical point of around 830, and this was in Reynolds number, and this was the first question mark that arose here, because if you do simulations and experiments, you will find stripes of turbulence far below that. So at 600, you find them, and at 750, you will find that they split and branch out. So all of that seems to happen far below what they proposed as a critical point in their experiment. Okay, let me just show these movies quickly. So that's just to show stripes decay, they disappear, and stripes split. So you could say, okay, it looks very similar to pipes, and indeed, well, okay, the splitting is just starting here, but our channel only has a certain length, so we can we can see when it starts, but that is, as I said, one of the difficulties, not having periodic boundary conditions in these experiments. Right, so then the surprising point comes when you do the statistics of that. And we do the statistics for exactly the experiments I'm showing to here for full stripes before they hit any sidewalls, so they're all happily inside the channel. We should look at the red data sets now. These are from our experiments, and you see they don't fall on these exponential scales. What we would have expected from pipe flow in gray, these exponential memoryless processes. Then we repeat the channel flow, because channel flow with periodic boundary conditions in direct numerical simulations is reported to be memoryless. Even critical point has been described in the same way. So we put periodic boundary conditions, and it nicely is memoryless. Then we repeat the direct numerical simulation, but we make our domain much larger. I think 400 by 400. I don't have the, where 2h is a gap. So we made the domain 400 by 400. The memorylessness goes away. As soon as you have a localized stripe that is not connecting to itself across the periodic boundary conditions, I'm talking about simulations, not experiments, the memorylessness goes away and you get something that ages. So that happens in simulations as well as experiments. These localized turbulent stripes age, and if you look at the splitting probabilities of turbulent stripes, also not memoryless, again, it's an aging process. And I can tell you in detail, well, in at least some more detail, what ages and why it ages. But since I promised just to take up not more than 5 minutes, let me just stop at that note that it's not a memoryless process. And okay, well, why we have the movie, then I say a few words more. If we zoom in here now, so this is a stripe in channel 4, a localized stripe, DNS, you see that a blue and red streak appear sort of, at very regular times. So you have, this is a co-moving frame of reference, so normally the stripe would move diagonally across, but you basically have an instability here at the tip that deterministically creates new streaks. You can also see that here in these snapshots, that at each of these time steps, you have a pair red-blue appearing. So there's another pair here, another pair here. So it's a completely regular process. It's not a stochastic process. And this is one of the aspects that kills this memoryless nature, and that we believe most likely also, at least I cannot see how you can still stay in the directed percolation universality class if you have these aging processes. Very close to the critical point, things may change again. So I cannot say asymptotically close, but at least for the Reynolds numbers where we can do measurements, it's quite clear that there's no sign of any directed percolation. Okay, I skip pipe flow and I get to the conclusions. All right, so what I wanted to get across, well, maybe the first point to make, the critical point for turbulence in pipe flow is somewhere around 240, let's say 236 is what we measured. And it's basically in the very sense that Reynolds said, you have to perturb the flow. So if you just sit there and you have a laminar flow and you wait for turbulence to happen, you can just increase the Reynolds number above 236, nothing will happen. You need to start with turbulence. So it's in a sense of an absorbing state phase transition that you should view it from a turbulent flow. And if you reduce the Reynolds number, everything will decay as you go below 2036. So in that sense, the critical point is defined, but very much the same spirit that Osborne-Reynolds defined it in. It's a second order phase transition, so it's a continuous one. It's a non-equilibrium process, obviously. We have to feed energy into the system at all times to keep things flowing. And the transition, at least for Couette flow, we can say that it's in the direct universality class. And I want to thank many people from my group and collaborators. I just put names up here. And thank you very much for your attention. Questions, please.